Before introducing the speaker, I'd just like to say that the Department of Italian Studies is co-sponsoring this talk with NYU Department of English. So I want to thank Toral Gajaravala, who is Associate Professor of English here, who has been co-organizing this with me, and also Julian Sachs, who I think is not here, who's been sort of doing the technical and publicity for it. Why is this flashing? Just to worry you. I think it's just a bad connection here, isn't it? You shouldn't have to fix it, actually. No. Better get this right before we start. So I'm very pleased to welcome Neelam Srivastava, who is this thing doesn't.
It's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Neelam Srivastava, who is a reader, which in the UK means kind of associate professor, I suppose, or whatever, something just near professor, full professor, in post-colonial and comparative literature at Newcastle University. Her research interests include post-colonial print cultures, Italian colonialism in the Horn of Africa, which is part of the subject of the talk today, and contemporary South Asian literature. She co-founded the Post-Colonial Print Cultures International Research Network. She co-edited, and I must do a plug for this, with Baidak Bhattacharya, the Post-Colonial Gramsci, which is a really important book published by Routledge in 2012, and also co-edited Indian Literature in the World, Multilingualism, Translation in the Public Sphere, published by Palgrave last year. She's associate editor of the journal Interventions, International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, and what she's going to talk about tonight is a new book that came out, I think, just this year, published by Palgrave, called Italian Colonialism and Resistances to Empire. This is the picture on the cover. It's a beautiful photograph of this. Is it what a Fiat garage, isn't it? Like a petrol station in Asmara. Those of you who know a bit about Italian colonial history know that it started in the 1890s. It ended in the 1940s. I think already, and maybe if Neelam doesn't say it, but she probably will, I'll say it, it didn't start in 1930. It started really in 1896, 1st of March 1896, with the Battle of Algiers, which, according to Italian nationalist history, is a great moment of defeat and national shame, the kind of Verdun of Italian history. But of course, for the anti-colonial movement, for the Pan-African movement, it was a great victory of an African nation against white imperialism. So what we're looking at here is the kind of later development of this around, of course, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. And what Neelam does is carry this up to a much later period, up to around 1970, and sees the connections between anti-fascism and anti-colonialism. I haven't read the book yet, so I'm really excited to hear about how what is covered in it and how Neelam's going to present it. So please join me in welcoming Neelam Srivastava.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak at the Casa Italiana. I'm very honored and excited. This is also because part of the book talks about New York, so it's exciting for me to be here. So thank you so much for coming. Oh yes.
Thank you.
So This book is entitled Italian Colonialism and Responses to Empire, 1930 to 1970. And as David has just said, of course, Italian colonialism doesn't begin in 1930. It begins much earlier, or a bit earlier, at the end of the 19th century. My book presents, what it wants to do is present a cultural history of Italian colonialism and anti-colonialism. So I'm looking at the history of colonialism, but I am trying to do an oppositional history at the same time by looking at Italian anti-colonialism, not only Italian. Its aim is to show that Italy's imperial ambitions played a fundamental, though overlooked, role in the development of an oppositional discourse to Western imperialism more broadly. And I examine this claim in relation to a significant moment in the history of empire and resistance, the interwar period, which witnessed the consolidation of anti-colonial ideas that prefigure the work of post-colonial theory. Now, the Italian case presents some unique and distinct characteristics compared to the far more established liberal empires of Britain and France, which were arguably, but we can talk about this more, based on a stronger and older sense of national unity. Italy was a rather belated newcomer on the imperialist stage and only founded its first colony, Eritrea, in 1890, barely 30 years after unification in 1861. The colony of Somalia soon followed, and then Libya was invaded in 1911, forming the fourth shore of Italy's national territory. Italian colonialism influenced the articulation of anti-colonial discourse precisely because it was so belated. The fascist regime's illegal invasion of Ethiopia occurred in 1935, when anti-imperialist movements and alliances were flourishing across the globe, and Western public opinion was beginning to seriously question the values underpinning the colonial project. Empire, in other words, was in crisis at the same time in which Italy was invading. In this sense, then, Italy's actions in Ethiopia received widespread condemnation, international condemnation, and provided a golden opportunity for anti-colonial activists, especially Pan-Africanists, to highlight the cruelty and barbarism of imperialism to an increasingly sympathetic global audience. Furthermore, the coexistence of Italy's colonial aspirations with massive emigration altered the standard structure of the colonial relationship as it was conceived within British and French imperialism, and sowed the seed, I argue, for Italian internationalist and third world solidarity in the post-war. Early Italian colonial theories, by championing what Mark I. Choate calls emigrant colonialism, emphasized the ways in which Italy could become an internationally significant power in the world through the exportation of its labor and the dissemination of typically Italian cultural and social traits abroad. It could also boost its economy thanks to the remittances that emigrants sent back home. And as is well known, the word colonia had two meanings in this early period. It meant both Italian emigrant communities abroad, for example in North and South America, and Italian colonial territories in North and East Africa. It made complete economic and political sense for Italy to pursue a policy that promoted both emigration and overseas territories at the same time, because it lacked capital to invest in establishing colonies abroad, unlike France and Britain. Such an approach to colonialism shakes up conventional understandings of hegemonic versus subaltern relationships in post-colonial studies, as it does not distinguish neatly between colonization and diaspora. Whereas in British and French colonial theories, it was through territorial conquest that the colonizers' cultural and political hegemony could be established over the colonized populations. At the same time, emigration was symptomatic of Italy's internal colonialism, quote unquote, the systematic exploitation of the Italian working classes on the part of the elites and the wealthy North, and of the wealthy North extracting maximum economic advantage out of the impoverished South. As Antonio Gramsci acutely observed, these are the Italian colonial territories in 1936, Libya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea. And the Dodecanese as well, I think, is vaguely visible there. So Italian colonial expansion was also mirrored by this internal colonialism, and as Antonio Gramsci acutely observed in the early 1930s, the poverty of a country is relative. Emigration is a consequence of the inability of the ruling class to put the population to work, and not of national poverty. And so with this critique, Gramsci, and I'll be talking about this a bit later, is effectively, this is his response, in a way, to socialist imperialism, to this idea of Lebensraum, that it is not about Italy not having enough territory. It is the way, obviously, wealth is distributed within the country. And so this radical critique responded directly to Mussolini's brand of social imperialism that was presented to Italians as their right to a place in the sun. On the other hand, for Gramsci, colonialism always stems from internal hegemonies, which subject subaltern classes within the nation to economic and political exploitation. Now, what I was interested in doing in this book was the history of Italian colonialism has been beautifully explored by many, many eminent historians, some of which are present in the room as well. And I do a bit of that, but really what I'm most interested in is the ways in which Italian colonialism impacts on ideas of anti-colonialism in the period that I mentioned, between 1930 and 1970. And one of the case studies that I look at is the response of the Italian Communist Party to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Or rather, its response to Mussolini's imperialism. The Italian Communist Party, steered by Gramsci's internationalist vision and by the Comintern's supportive stance towards anti-imperialist movements, outlined a specifically Italian anti-colonialism, which I trace in the book, which looked outwardly towards global solidarity with the oppressed, with migrant labor worldwide, because Italians had experienced firsthand discrimination and oppression, both as immigrants and within their own country. So I traced the story of the Italian Communist Party anti-colonial campaign in favor of Ethiopia after it was invaded by Mussolini in 1935, trying to actually use it as a lever to topple the regime. Of course, it didn't happen, because we know that the Ethiopian War is the highest point of Mussolini's popularity with Italians. But the PC thought that they could do something by showing up this war as unpopular. However, arguably, the seeds of an Italian internationalism had been sown in those years, also thanks to the strenuous propaganda efforts of the Italian Communist Party. In the book, I look at the ways in which anti-colonialism and anti-fascism in the 1930s within the Italian left prefigure, in a way, the Italian Resistenza. Also thinking about the ways in which, after 1945, the Italian Resistenza was recast as a war of liberation against fascism, so that the connections and the analogies between anti-colonial struggle and anti-fascist struggle were constructed in the years after the resistance had happened. What I also do in the book is I look at a group or a series of Italian intellectuals, often ex-partisans who had fought in the resistance, who saw decolonization movements in the 1960s and 70s as an ideal continuation of anti-fascist struggle. So I am talking about analogies and also about the ways in which anti-fascists saw these struggles as analogous. For example, one figure I look at in the book, Giovanni Pirelli, who was an anti-fascist, he became friends with Frantz Fanon in the early 60s. His understanding of the Italian resistance was subsequently shaped by his involvement with the Algerian cause, with the Algerian War of Independence. So the later chapters of my book look at, especially at cultural production in relationship to this shared, what we might call resistance aesthetics of anti-colonialism and anti-fascism. And of course, a very famous example of this is the Battle of Algiers, the 1966 film by Gillo Pontecorvo, again, another ex-partisan. Of course, it's important to remember that the relationship the post-war Italian left had with anti-colonialism was contradictory and ambivalent at best. On the one hand, there was great support for anti-imperialist struggles like Vietnam, Algeria, and on the other, a very puzzling amnesia in relationship to Italy's colonial past that never figured in the imagination of the Italian anti-fascists. So Italian anti-colonialism is part of the wider narrative about metropolitan anti-colonialism that I trace in the book, namely a global politics of resistance that developed between 1930 and 1970, which would crystallize into solidarities between anti-fascists and anti-colonialisms in the lead up to the Second World War. And part of my argument is that anti-colonialism and anti-fascism are part and parcel of the same ideal, a will to transform the nation from within, a new conception of nation that rejects imperialism and fascism in the same breath. So these two things are linked. It's again, that fight against an internal colonialism that links them to a wider external struggle. And the history of metropolitan anti-colonialism has not received, I feel, the full scholarly attention it deserves, partly because there's a tendency to produce a narrative of post-colonial thought as a stark struggle between undifferentiated colonizers and undifferentiated colonized. Of course, this dichotomy has a validity, and it's strategic and important, but as a historicist approach to the formation of post-colonial thought in the 30s can serve to identify the interwar and immediate post-war periods as crucial milestones in the history of anti-colonial activism. It also encouraged us to reevaluate historical figures who prepared the intellectual groundwork of post-colonial studies before it became known as such. Such figures, I would argue, have been left out of established narratives of the field because their political commitment to the anti-colonial cause sits uneasily either with their metropolitan location or with their mistrust of the emancipatory promises held out to colonized peoples by European communism. So I guess I'm telling more than one story in this book, but the two stories I'm telling is one, the story of metropolitan anti-colonialism, and at the same time, the story of some aspects of Pan-Africanism that in the wake of the Ethiopian War distanced themselves from communism. George Padmore, CLR James, Claude McKay are three figures I look at, whose work I look in the book, especially in their literary writings. All of them we know were socialists, were Marxists, that goes without saying. But their alienation from Marxism begins with the war. They feel betrayed by the Comintern and by what they saw as an alliance of white nations who left Ethiopia behind. My case studies in this book are centered on avowedly partisan figures who championed an anti-colonial and anti-fascist politics. And as I said, these include the Pan-Africanist thinker George Padmore, the great protagonist of the Harlem Renaissance Claude McKay, the feminist, socialist, and anti-colonial campaigner Sylvia Pankhurst, the filmmaker Gillo Pontecorvo, and the great and extraordinary writer Giovanni Pirelli, who was friends, as I said, with Fanon. And what I trace is the ways in which they're partisans. We can think of partisans as those who take sides. A commitment to a political cause that does not come from a filial relationship to one's culture or nation, but from an affiliative one, a chosen allegiance, as it were. And I aim to reverse the negative connotations of the Italian word partigianeria, or partisanship, in order to assert the values of a political affiliation that, to quote Lila Gandhi, sidesteps assimilability within the major forms of the political. So, in other words, being a partisan is not an obvious or instinctive stance. It's not coming out of a perceived allegiance to one's own nation. It is fighting for a cause that is usually not one's own. When Italian anti-fascists produced cultural texts that sought to link anti-imperialist struggle with their experience of fighting against the Germans and Mussolini, they were enacting a form of affiliation, a form of voluntary empathy, a rejection of, quote, the idiom of their own colonizing culture. European empires like fascism, as we know, were not monolithic discursive structures, and they did not command the unqualified support of all their citizens. So I guess I'm looking at this sort of, at the failures of imperial binarisms, helping us to undo manichaistic approaches to the study of resistance. And in the spirit of Lila Gandhi, whose book I've learned a lot from, I look at resistance as a transnational concept and as a partisan concept. Of course, remaining mindful of very different investments of Pan-Africanists and British anti-colonialists and Italian anti-colonialists in Italian imperialism in Africa. In order to, I was interested, no, not again, no. Let's see if this comes back. Just not touch it. In order to explore this idea of the partisan, I turned to Carl Schmitt, who's not an obvious interlocutor, of course, because he's a very conservative philosopher, as we know. But he writes a book called The Theory of the Partisan, and he writes it, interestingly, in the 1960s, at a moment in which there's a sort of reevaluation of this figure, reflecting back on those who had fought against Nazi fascism. He defines the partisan as an irregular combatant, who has an essentially defensive and Tellurian character. He protects his territory, his homeland. I'm looking at Schmitt, but I also want to move away from this, offering an internationalist rather than nationalist understanding of partisanship. seeking to highlight the connections between anti-colonial and anti-fascist commitments in specific moments of a transnational history of empire. This position, as I was saying earlier, does not come naturally, as Schmitt seems to suggest with relationship to his idea of territorial partisanship. On the contrary, internationalism is not an instinctive defense, but a deliberate stance, an unconventional action, and above all, an individual choice. To give you an example, for thinkers in post-war Italy, the Italian resistance came to represent a more complex and less territorial idea of patria, homeland, than one based on mere commonality of origin. It was actually aiming to replace one type of society with another. So when anti-fascists talk about liberating Italy from fascism, this is, the territory that's being fought over is Italy itself, but the enemy is not external. So the Resistenza, as we know, has been written about, has been historicized as a civil war, even more than an event that was obviously key to the Second World War. There are no facile or ethnic distinctions that signal the difference between friend and enemy. This quote from Schmitt I found quite useful. He says, "To be a partisan is precisely to avoid carrying weapons openly, the partisan being one who fights from ambushes, who wears the enemy uniform and whatever insignia serves his turn, as well as civilian clothing." So the partisans I look at in this book, to some extent, were in camouflage, because some of them were of European origin, and thus were hidden from view in retrospective narratives of anti-colonialism, whose opponents always are deemed to belong to the other side. And yet these radical partisans, of course, the European ones, appear alongside their comrades in arms, George Padmore, Claude McKay, CLR James, who did much to publicize and disseminate ideas that helped to critique imperialism among European audiences. I find useful Lila Gandhi's notion of self-othering, to describe such activists who were born within the imperial culture, but who display a radical commitment to the colonized, influenced and inspired by their struggles. We could say that these anti-campaigners exhibit a form of internal dissidence with their own culture. And arguably, the flow of ideas does not, as usual, go from Europe to the colonies, but vice versa. That I'm interested in these figures because they were so influenced by third worldist ideas, by anti-colonial ideas that were coming to them from the outside. And I think that this notion of internationalism also helps to explain, for example, the huge and widespread British support for the Ethiopian cause against the Italians. And we should remember in the 30s, Britain was the biggest empire in the world, and yet the British were on the side of the Ethiopians. So these are paradoxical moments in the history of empire that are puzzling, that make us think. Okay, so, no, again, it's like, it'll come back. Oh, sorry. Just shouldn't touch it, basically, but I think, yeah, okay, great, yeah. I won't touch it. So just to, before I comment on this quote, Italian colonialism in the 1930s, as we know, represented a matter of great prestige for Italy. The defeat of Adwa, as David had mentioned before, was not far behind them. Soon after coming to power in 1922, Mussolini made Italy's imperialist identity a cornerstone of his policy through a massive use of propaganda. And of course, historians have looked at the continuities between liberal and fascist imperialism. But perhaps the new thing that Mussolini introduces in his imperialism is the massive use of propaganda and print culture. He wanted to make this into a great colonial war. He promoted it as a mechanized war, a sort of showpiece for fascist Italy as a modern, efficient, and undefeatable regime. As the futurist and fascist poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti said of the Ethiopian War, quote, "The war has a beauty of its own because it serves the power of great fascist Italy." And historians such as Giorgio Rochat have argued that this was not a colonial war, this was a national war. So that it took the energies, swept up the energies of the entire nation. We know that this was a war characterized by ruthlessness and extreme brutality and atrocity against Ethiopians. Also because Italy's colonial policy under Mussolini was that of a complete and direct domination without any colonized intermediaries. So there was no compromise with the Ethiopian side on the part of the Italians. And the rhetoric justifying the invasion was to show Ethiopians as barbaric and uncivilized. Barbara Sorgoni argues that Italian anthropological theory needed to construct a we for a young Italian nation, which was still in the process of defining its identity. Most importantly, this we of the Italian colonizer was set against the them of Ethiopians, Eritreans, and Somalis, and had to be premised on a concept of the modern European. This claim to modernity would be subsequently deployed to great effect by Haile Selassie and his supporters against the Italian invaders, arguing that it was Ethiopia that was the modern civilized nation, whose sovereign rights as a member of the League of Nations had been trampled upon by the barbarous troops of Mussolini and his infamous black shirts. Now, in the years in which Mussolini was promoting his Italy as a world empire, in these years, in the 30s, it was also being subjected to an intensive and insightful critique on the part of the Italian Communist Party, which sought to counter the socialist imperialism of Enrico Corradini and Giovanni Pascoli, on which fascist imperialism drew its sustenance. And in particular, as I was mentioning earlier, Gramsci develops an acute analysis of the shortcomings of Italian imperialism, all the more impressive because there wasn't much access to data in a period of censorship. So I mentioned earlier that early Italian colonial theories brought together the idea of emigration and colonialism, and that colonia meant both diasporic and colonial Italian settlements. Mark Choate argues that the Libyan War, the invasion of Libya in 1911, steered Italians more towards a more aggressive foreign policy and a privileging of territorial colonies over emigrant settlements. And the cultural justification for this kind of aggressive foreign policy was given by poets, of all people. So Giovanni Pascoli, one of the great Italian national poets, in 1911, a couple of months after the invasion of Libya, penned a famous speech, La grande proletaria si è mossa. The great proletarian nation stirs, moves. And it was a moral and political justification of the invasion, of the Libyan invasion. So we're talking some years earlier than Ethiopia. He characterizes Italy as a great proletarian nation, in need of its place in the sun, thus prefiguring Mussolini's imperialist rhetoric. So what Pascoli does in this speech is that he establishes a marked contrast between diaspora and colonization. And he uses this we of the Italian nation, that this war, the Libyan War, will restore a sense of greatness to Italy, to the Italian people who have been too long crushed under foreign rule in their own land and subject to foreign hegemonies when they were forced to emigrate. And I quote from, so I've just translated very badly a few lines from this speech. They, the Italians, had become a bit like Negroes in America. They, the compatriots of he who had discovered it. And like Negroes, who were at times pushed outside the law and humanity, they were lynched. He's referring to racist incidents that occurred against Italians in the United States, for example. But the colonization of Libya, promises Pascoli, will bring back Italy's civilizing mission and will put a stop to this forced homelessness and exploitation of the Italian emigrant workers, who abroad are non più d'Italia, they are no longer of Italy. But in Libya, they will be settler farmers on the soil of the homeland, because Rome is also over there, he says. The colonial territory is home for the Italian worker, whereas the diaspora most manifestly is not. So these socialist endorsements of imperialism, championing the colony as an extension of the patria, of the homeland, ultimately aimed at substituting extensive Italian emigration with colonization, and would form the basis for Mussolini's notion of Italian colonialism as the empire of labor. And again, arguably Mussolini is trying to create a brand for Italian imperialism, which is based on this idea of the impero del lavoro, of empire of labor. He is different, his is different from the British and the French, sort of absentee landlords in Africa. Now, this quote, this speech is quite interesting to read alongside Gramsci's critique. So Gramsci in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, writing, of course, from prison, in the prison notebooks, effectively takes this idea of the great proletarian nation and turns it on its head, and delves deep into this idea of why should a nation always, I don't know how visible that is, should a nation always take the path of nationalism and imperialism? Is there another way? So I want to read out this quite long quotation from the prison notebooks, which is from 1932, because here Gramsci elaborates an idea of Italian anti-colonialism which looks outwardly towards global solidarity with the oppressed, with migrant labor worldwide. Yes, labor is at the center of this, but indeed, Italians can establish connections with oppressed groups rather than using labor as a way to exert domination. So in a way, I think in this passage, he's almost rewriting Pascoli, and in a different key. Labor and subalternity and not ethnicist nationalism is what must unite proletarians across the globe, argues Gramsci. And as I said, for him, emigration was precipitated by a situation of internal colonialism, because the Italian elites kept the majority of the population in a state of economic and political subalternity. Imperialism, he argues, could not be a satisfactory solution for Italy, impoverished as it was. So in this passage, he recuperates the idea of Pascoli's proletarian nation by turning it on its head. And I've highlighted a couple of the parts which are of interest. Must the national movement that brought about the unification of the Italian state necessarily result in nationalism and in nationalistic and military imperialism? This is the question with which he opens the quotation, and I won't read it out. But it's an extraordinarily interesting passage in the notebooks because also he's recuperating the idea of cosmopolitanism, and we normally associate Gramsci as a great critic of cosmopolitanism because arguably cosmopolitanism was sort of a disaster for the formation of a strong Italian national identity, because in this way, with cosmopolitanism, Gramsci argues in other parts of the notebooks, it drew heavily on elite and foreign sources for the production of literature and art, rather than attempting to forge indigenous traditions into a national popular culture. But here, we see that in a way Gramsci recuperates cosmopolitanism in a very distinct way, in an internationalist dimension. So on the one hand, Gramsci argues that cosmopolitanism had prevented Italy from forming a serviceable and strong national culture in the wake of the Risorgimento and after unification. But here, he recuperates it as a positive value. Italian emigrants, neglected by the state and its elites, can help to lead the anti-imperialist struggle because they are akin to the colonized themselves. And he also, I feel, racializes this passage. Now, notice how, I'll just go back a second to Pascoli. Here, I haven't translated this bit, but Pascoli uses words like how Italians were called abroad, carcamanos, gringos, cincali, degos, right? So that's obviously a very negative and pejorative term used against Italians in the United States. So it's certainly Pascoli's passage is very racialized. Arguably Gramsci's is as well. It's perhaps less marked. But here as well, he's taking this idea of the proletarian nation and investing it with a revolutionary potential. It may well be a proletarian nation. I'm reading from the highlighted bit. Proletarian is a nation because it was the reserve army of foreign capitalisms, because together with the Slavic peoples, it furnished manpower to the whole world. Precisely because of this, it must join the modern front of struggle in order to reorganize the non-Italian world, which it helped to create with its own work. Italians have been subalterns abroad, so they are well equipped to understand the condition of subalternity. So it suggests a new form of thinking about anti-colonialism, not just a form of resistance emanating from the periphery, but from the very heart of Europe, from an erstwhile imperialist power. So he's trying to make us think about the analogies. And there's two things to be said about this passage. One might say, well, he's writing in prison, not for a public, or at least not for a living public that he would see. So what is the use of him writing these things? But in fact, Gramsci's anti-colonial policies profoundly influenced Italian Communist Party policies in the late 20s. So the Thesis of Lyon, for example, which in a way arguably were the foundation of the party, have a chapter on colonial and national theses. They had the colonial question firmly in mind. The Italian Communist Party had the colonial question firmly in mind almost from its very inception. So what is interesting here for me is that as much as Marxism influences and shapes and supports anti-colonial movements emerging in the 20th century shape the formation of communism and Marxism in these years. So we see this dual influence at work. This was evident to Italian leftists in the 30s, but it becomes more and more obvious to Italians in the post-war, when World War II is recast as a war of liberation and resistance from totalitarian oppression. And of course those links were made by philosophers, obviously Hannah Arendt and many others make those links between fascism and colonialism. But those links were obvious to activists in the 30s as well. Okay. So apologies for the long quote here. So this is one aspect of what I've been looking at in the book, and I'll just make one other example if I have some time, and then wrap up. Another part of the book looks at the reaction of the African diaspora to the widespread and unprecedented response, I should say, of the African diaspora to the Ethiopian War. And the transformation of racial thinking that the Ethiopian War engendered among Italians was more than matched by the ways in which the Ethiopian War triggered a rethinking of blackness among African Americans. So we see that the Ethiopian War has a profound effect on notions of identity. We know that Ethiopia had been considered a black homeland in the long tradition of dissident underground religious formations among black slaves and later among emancipated blacks. It was a land of profound religious and spiritual significance for diasporic Africans. And it was not by chance that the name of the most prominent and famous church in Harlem, which would later host many well-attended rallies and meetings in favor of Ethiopia, was the Abyssinian Baptist Church. So that Abyssinia and Ethiopia are names that resonate very, very deeply with the African-American religious and spiritual imagination. The ideology of black liberation and the designation of Ethiopia and Harlem as two key sites of an imagined community where blacks were free had profound roots in the refashioning of concepts of race among 20th century black diasporic peoples, especially those who lived in North America. And this perhaps chimes in part with the idea of Benedict Anderson's imagined community, whose development in the minds of its would-be citizens owed much to newspapers and novels. And certainly such media, newspapers and novels, played a hugely important role in the shaping of an imagined transnational community for the black diaspora. But the difference with Anderson, of course, is that this is a transnational notion and it's not a national ethnicist, well, partly ethnicist, but it isn't based on a territorial unity. This black imagined community, which emerges even more clearly in newspapers of the time, around 1935, drew on the resources of a neighborhood of New York, whose racial borders were heavily policed on the one hand, and in a faraway, little-known empire in East Africa, which had held rich symbolic associations for blacks, while most self-evidently remote from the ordinary lives of most African Americans and African Caribbeans. It is, when you look at the materials that emerge around the Ethiopian War, what is really surprising is why did it capture the imagination of African Americans and African Caribbeans so much? It is a land that is far away. Arguably, not many African Americans would be able even to trace their genealogy back to Ethiopia, but probably more likely to West Africa. And yet Ethiopia is the homeland. It is the spiritual homeland. This small landlocked nation, thousands of miles away. The point was that Ethiopia was a free nation. It was a sovereign state. So in this sense, this is where, in the imagination, blacks were free. They were not free in the Caribbean. They were not free in the United States. So black ideologies of liberation fixed on Ethiopia as a potent symbol of Pan-African uprising. And yet, as David Forgach has recently shown, the racial discourses pertaining to Ethiopians, indeed their very racial classification, were quite complex and often subject to deliberate appropriation on various sides of the Italy-Ethiopia conflict. In examining these racial discourses, it emerges quite clearly that Italian invasion provoked a profound rethinking of blackness, both among African Americans and among Italians themselves. So it's possible to distinguish, I think, three strands of racial debates that emerge around the invasion of Ethiopia. Firstly, the blackening of Ethiopians on the part of those like the fascist regime who desired to justify the invasion as a civilizing mission. So that was the first, and this is, of course, the work that David Forget has done in showing how Italians whitened themselves and simultaneously blacken Ethiopians in order to justify the invasion. Secondly, the black diaspora claims that Ethiopians were blacks. So this is happening at the same time, and thus could represent a truly free black people. Thirdly, the racial discourse that Ethiopians held about themselves, and which they partially attempted to disseminate among African Americans on the several trips that Ethiopian official delegates paid to the Harlem black community. So, as David Forget has shown, prior to the invasion, Italians did not consider Ethiopians to be exclusively black. So this was before the invasion. They considered them to be white or of Semitic descent. A position that echoed that of Ethiopians themselves, who attributed to themselves a red complexion to distinguish themselves from whites, blacks, and other races. And indeed, Marcus Garvey accused Haile Selassie and Ethiopians more generally of dissociating themselves from black movements abroad because they did not consider themselves, quote-unquote, Negro. And it's quite interesting to trace the development of this, the evolution of this word Negro versus Ethiopian in the newspapers of the time. So at the same time in which Italians are blackening Ethiopians, they are whitening themselves. And this is obviously one of the most famous images associated with the racial laws, the Manifesto of the Race published in 1938, the whitening of Italians, which classified all Italians as Aryans. And you see the sword that divides the head of the statue, of the Roman statue, from the head of what was clearly supposed to be a Semitic statue, and the photograph of a young African woman in tribal dress. A white hand holding a sword separated the Roman bust from the Semitic head and the African woman's head. And the symbolism was clear. Italians were neither Semitic nor African. And indeed would be justified in waging war against such peoples in the future in order to defend the purity of their race. And of course, another interesting point about this is that Italians, subject to internal colonialisms, there was obviously a lot of internal racism among northern and southern Italians, and yet this is elided in this kind of refashioning. So on the one hand, Italian fascism is hard at work to blacken Ethiopians and other East Africans in order to portray them as racially inferior. And at the same time, an inverse appropriation of the Ethiopians' racial features was happening within the black diaspora. With the invasion, there was an instant and spontaneous racial solidarity on the part of many African diaspora communities with the Ethiopians. They saw Ethiopians as black and hence as their brothers. And this prompts a rethinking of race itself, a growing consciousness that the term Negro was often reviled by Africans as pertaining to slaves and a shameful past of slavery. So Negro was a specifically American term. And some letters to readers, the Pittsburgh Courier was a prominent African-American newspaper of those years, revealed the extent to which African Americans were beginning to redefine themselves in relationship to a common African descent and Ethiopia in particular. This is one reader who says, "Please, editor, drop the word Negro. Do use our own real name, Ethiopians. Africans absolutely refuse to be called Negroes. Why should we continue to hold on to the slave-given name?" And arguably, again, there's a sort of international understanding of blackness that helps to provincialize these words, the word Negro for among African Americans. So many readers of the Courier are writing in constantly with inventive genealogies such as Asiatics. And Stephanie Newell, in a different context, speaks of print subjectivities, sort of self-fashioning through print. These are also, in a way, arguably through the newspaper, through African American newspapers, there's a co-production of racial identities, or rethinking of racial identities, that is drawing very much on the rhetoric of the invasion, of the siding, the partisan siding with Ethiopia. I guess I should probably start, wrapping up. just a couple of more things. I was just going to show you two more slides, or two more examples of this kind of refashioning, rethinking of racial identity in the wake of the invasion. Again, we should notice the year in which this is written. This was published in 1935. These are all letters that are coming out around, I mean, the invasion hasn't yet happened, but it's, it was known that it was on the cards. This is another example from the African-American historian J.A. Rogers, who's in an article called Tells Why We Should Help Ethiopia. Negro has a meaning quite special to the United States. One as blonde as a Scandinavian may be classed as Negro in America. African peoples, being of the same color, do not think in color terms, but in national or tribal ones. Hence, when an Ethiopian, West African, Brazilian, or British West Indian denies he is a Negro, it does not necessarily mean he is denying racial kinship with African Americans, so much as that he refuses to swallow the ridiculous American Negro. Most Afro-Americans need to clarify their thinking on this point. And Rogers was a very popular public figure in Harlem, and keen to recuperate a black history. Part of this is about recuperating a black history, an Afrocentric history that would move away from slavery and center, for example, on the history of an African kingdom, such as that of Ethiopia. My last example comes from a book by Claude McKay, which was only published this year, though it was not, written in 1941, Amiable with Big Teeth, a novel of the love affair between the communists and the poor black sheep of Harlem. It is sort of the novel, the great novel about the Ethiopian War. It's a novel about the conflict that Black Harlem had with the Communist International's attempt to instrumentalize their opposition to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia and to co-opt their struggle. And there's an extraordinary passage in this novel. So you notice the hammer and sickle on the cover. It's a novel that's very critical of communism, though we know McKay starts off as a socialist. There's a dialogue between two female characters in the novel, two African-American women, one of whom passes as white. Seraphine passes as white. And she has a romantic relationship with this Ethiopian envoy, Lij Alamaya. And so she's telling this to her friend, Banchetta. So Seraphine says, once I said to him that it was nice that we two could pass together. He didn't understand, so I explained to him what passing was, and he was very angry. He said he was not passing, he was proud to be an Ethiopian. I told him he couldn't live in the Santa Cruz if he were a dark Ethiopian. He said he didn't care where he lived, and he thought passing was cheapening to the person who was passing if he had any pride in being himself. He couldn't understand the American point of view. He's perspicacious, said Banchetta. Now, Banchetta is a communist. It's important to remember that. The human point of view is more important than the American point of view. It is the American point of view, the German point of view, the British point of view, and all the different nations' point of view that makes a mess of the world. Now we have the Popular Front, to which all peoples with the right human point of view can belong. So this passage is interesting because it shows how the arrival of the Ethiopian envoy to Harlem can actually teach something to his African-American friend about her own identity, that passing is a specifically American concept. It also is a debate around the common terms appropriation of the struggle, of the African-American struggle for Ethiopia. That the communist view is the human view, that there can be no other perspective. So that other forms of imagining solidarity in this period were not considered to be rightly human. So human is above black, is above white, is above Ethiopian, is above Afro-American. Communist racial integration clearly placed the interests of the white proletariat above all others. So I'm going to conclude now. So my examination of Gramsci's diasporic anti-colonialism alongside the writings of Pan-Africanists all demonstrate that the emergence of socialism and communism as revolutionary is inextricable from their concomitant development of an anti-colonial politics. So as much as communism, as I was saying earlier, supports anti-colonialism, anti-colonial movements shape communism in these years. Pankhurst, Padmore, McKay, and Pirelli's and Pontecorvo's connection to communism often led them to question the former and develop the latter in the direction of an anti-colonial political and cultural expression. With the advent of World War II and decolonization, many of the more innovative developments in Marxist politics shift to the so-called Third World, challenging the oft-repeated claim that Marxism and the history of capital are the ultimate explanatory framework for all post-colonial political processes. What I look at in the book is the ways in which anti-colonialism profoundly shaped Marxism itself as a revolutionary and emancipatory ideology in the 20th century. Thank you.
so much, Neelam. That was great. Let's take some questions. I have one, but I will hold it back. So I'd like you to maybe go first.
Sure. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really wonderful. My question is slightly comparative since I've worked, I've done some work on German colonialism, and so a lot of what you said about in opening about development of Italian anti-colonialism sounds very similar. A sort of not completely developed nationalism that then tries to assert itself in the sort of rush for Africa, and then this sort of like coterminous development of both sort of colonialist thought and anti-colonial impulses from within Italy. I guess, and then most importantly, this sort of amnesia in later anti-imperialism when it comes to Vietnam, it's exactly the same in the German context.
It's interesting.
There's even in scholarship, there's so little scholarship comparatively on German colonialism, and also the movement sort of forgot that history, right? But what I'm really interested in is, in your book, do you, because I haven't had the chance to read it, but do you go into sort of responses to Italian colonialism by Italian-speaking, either sort of Italians of color or colonized subjects, or were there responses, and I'm sure this is beyond the scope of your book, but in Amharic, in Somali, in Arabic, to what was happening? I think maybe the German case is slightly different since they had an education system set up, and there were German responses in the German language to German colonialism. So that was.
Thank you so much. That is the million-dollar question, right? So yes, I should say that what the book doesn't do is look at Ethiopian responses in detail because, well, partly because of the way it was shaped, but because I was very interested in tracing the contours of metropolitan anti-colonialism. This work is, of course, very necessary, and yes, there were extensive responses, and there is the work of many scholars that have looked at historically at the Ethiopian resistance and also at the sort of literary production in relationship to the invasion of Ethiopia. There's a contemporary novel by Gabriella Germandi which looks at, that has been translated into English, in fact, that is looking at the memories of the Italian invasion and of the Ethiopian resistance fighters. So it was obviously it was a hugely important moment in Ethiopian nationalism and in Ethiopian history. But the book doesn't look at this in detail for a variety of reasons. But I mean, maybe that's what I'll do next. I guess that's not a very good answer, but there's a lot of material that I haven't looked at. And I also just I guess what I was very interested in was also maybe sort of deconstructing a bit the grand narrative of Marxism and thinking more about how it's a bit more porous than we might think. Generally, I'm interested in seeing how ideas coming from the colonies are actually shaping European intellectual culture in those years. So, but yes, I completely need to do that. Thank you so much for your question.
Well, it came to my mind that many of the partisans who were communists certainly were internationalists early on because they got their experience in the Civil War in Spain, and they came, and so they had a different perspective. So I think it's very important. Bringing this down to a more pragmatic level in terms of the average Italian who was suffering because after the First World War, Italy was in very bad shape and they were really poor. I think many of them did not think in terms of empire, but in terms of work, and just being able to go and follow Mussolini, have some future of some kind. And of course, they did absorb the racist concepts and so on. I remember being in Italy, in Naples, the first time I went there, and the people would say to me, "Well, we're the blacks. If we go to Milan, it says no Neapolitans allowed." So it was clear; everybody knew that. So I think Mussolini then used racism when he went in his colonial empire attempt, and then brought it back to Italy, full-fledged against the Jews and others. And it's an interesting thing. Most people believe that it wasn't Mussolini who was racist. It was Hitler who influenced him and insisted upon it. But I think we have to understand that Mussolini was racist early on, and when he was in the Balkans and in Africa, he really made their lives miserable and killed people and took wouldn't allow teachers to teach, any Jewish teachers, and then he used those approaches back in Italy. So I see there's a continuity.
Yeah, no, there's definitely continuity.
I mean, it just the resistance, the communists took their model. The Russian Revolution was their model, hoping that people would have more equality and that women in particular would have opportunities.
Yeah, for sure, and certainly anti-imperialism also influences the Russian Revolution. I mean, that is a very important sentiment in those years, and it's quite interesting that you mention obviously the Spanish Civil War, because at the time in which the Spanish Civil War in the 30s was associated so strongly with the Ethiopian War, and in a way that the prominence of the Spanish Civil War and the loyalties and the alliances that it engendered shadowed or overshadowed the fact that many had been involved in the Ethiopian resistance as well, or in supporting Ethiopia. But then Spain takes over because it's so close in terms, temporally speaking. And something that hasn't been very maybe noticed about, but now there's more interest in, is that there were some Italian partisans who went to fight in Ethiopia alongside the Ethiopians. One of them was Ilio Barantini, who then became he then went to fight in Spain, and then he became an anti-fascist partisan. And so his first testing ground as a partisan happens in Ethiopia itself. I mean, there were only 3 of them, and it's a sort of relatively little-known episode of they were Italian Communist Party cadres who went and tried to establish some alliances with the Ethiopian resistance fighters. It's more of a symbolic event than anything effective, but it's quite interesting that those 2 conflicts were seen in very similar ways: the Spanish Civil War and before that the Ethiopian War. So certainly that's a connection to be made. And just very briefly on the question of racism and in Italy, internal racism has existed for a long time. So those arguably, they're arguably also, the racism of the North against the South could arguably, the Southern question more broadly, could perhaps be said to have been then transplanted onto the colonies or some of that rhetoric or some of that symbolism. It's not that racism didn't exist in Italy. It certainly did. But I'm not sure that answered.
The question that expands from race to the issue of religion, and from a propaganda point of view, the whole Ethiopian campaign could not be justified as a sort of a crusade, as the Spanish War was.
That's right.
Because it would completely defeat the whole rhetoric of bringing Christianity or preserving Christianity. The Ethiopians were Christians before even Rome was.
That's right, they were.
One of the things that you heard from the veterans from Italy coming back to Italy said they told us we were going there to make them Christians. They were more Christian than us. And then there was the massacre of the Libanos, probably thousands of monks and friars killed. And so how is that the religious issue with the racial issue combined? That makes things even more complicated in terms of propaganda. And how did the propaganda machine of the fascist regime handle that fact? Because what happened there was known to the people that were there, but the news that arrived to the home front were different.
Was different.
So I was wondering whether the connection between the Ethiopians being racially different, so white and non-white, black and non-black, and at the same time have to be civilized, but being Christians already and of apostolic tradition.
Yes.
So one more.
There is a book on the reactions of the Vatican to the Ethiopian War, and there has been work done on this. From what I understand, it was that Mussolini was really pushing he also interestingly has these alliances with Islam. I mean, Mussolini has a very the sort of Islam. So he's very, I think, free and easy with religion in terms of how he mobilizes this for his own imperialist purposes. And as far as I know, but I'm sure there are lots of people in this room who know more about this than I do, he is not really using the religion card at all. And as you say, censorship prevented many Italians from knowing that these massacres had happened. But though many of these things were well known outside of Italy, like in Britain, some of these massacres and obviously the use of poison gas was very well known in Britain in the 1930s, and yet nothing was done. but he uses another kind of rhetoric, which of course is that of modernity, of civilization, of mechanization, the fact that, of course, that Ethiopians are slave owners, and so that Italy will come and liberate them from slavery. So I have a feeling that probably the kind of, and again, I apologize because I should know more about this, but I would imagine that the way they would have conceived of that form of Christianity would have been sort of a primitive form of Christianity that allowed for slavery, that allowed for uncivilized practices to exist. So they will come. That again, that the colonial war is a war of liberating Ethiopians from the evil and cruel despotic rule of Haile Selassie, and this could be connected then to their religion, which is so ancient as to not really figure as a form of civil. But it is very interesting, right? Because one so much associates Christianity with the colonizing mission, with the civilizing mission, and in the case of Ethiopia, this sort of is a paradox because it doesn't work. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't. But it is very interesting. And of course, the Vatican didn't say very much in relationship to this.
And there are accounts of military chaplains blessing the troops before they enter the Libanos, encouraging soldiers to kill as many monks as possible. So it's very.
I was very fascinated by your mentioning of Gramsci and cosmopolitanism and the kind of paradoxical cosmopolitanism that we were struggling with. And can you elaborate a little bit more about its relation to internationalism and the way it connects to this idea of third worldism as a kind of new cosmopolitan culture, which is kind of from the subaltern, but then elaborated beyond national boundaries?
Yeah.
Because this kind of the partisans and the was very much within the nation. You mentioned it as a kind of ethnic civil war almost, but in what way does it connect to
the broader struggle?
International struggle against imperialism.
The whole passage, I mean, this is partly also coming from Gramsci, but I think most internationalists would imagine the nation in an international relation, so that their understanding of the nation, which is always inherently revolutionary if we're taking internationalists on the left anyway, aims to reform the nation and aims to transform it from within by also positing alliances with the subaltern groups within the nation alongside subaltern groups outside of it. This would be, I think, one way in which Gramsci understands nationalism in an international dimension. This whole passage, he's very critical of nationalism, or of a certain kind of nationalism, which is based on capital, which is based on finance, especially based on finance capital that supports colonialism. And he says, the Italian people is, as a nation, the most interested in internationalism. Not only the worker, but also the peasant, and especially the southern peasant. So they have an inherently outward-looking, outward-facing moment, and it's interesting to read this passage alongside Carlo Levi's Christ Stopped at Eboli, because there he's when Levi is in Galliano, I always mix the two up. He realizes that the Italian peasants in this very small southern Italian town are being fed the line that Africa is being colonized so that they can go and cultivate the land there, and the peasant, the farmers there, they say, well, they're taking land away from them. That seems wrong, and they do the same with us. So they're not fooling us. They're not fooled by this imperialist rhetoric that there will be room for them, that this is a war that is being waged for them. So they in fact see themselves in solidarity more with the African peoples or the Ethiopians whose land has been taken away. This, I think, to make the connection, I feel comes back in this post-war period with this another form of anti-colonialism that emerges in people like Pontecorvo, in people like Pirelli, who were all partisans. The war is over. Fascism, in theory, has been defeated, but there's a moving line in Pirelli's work where he says, anti-fascism, the anti-fascist struggle continues in the anti-colonial struggle against to support colonized peoples. So he doesn't feel that the war against fascism is over in the post-war. It continues with, it's almost a sort of ideal continuation. For him, as a partisan, the resistance continues. It doesn't end. And so then, what I'm most interested in, because I'm a scholar of literature and look at film, so I'm interested in the ways in which this kind of aesthetic of anti-colonial and anti-fascist resistance comes across in literature and film. What does this produce? And there are some interesting connections that could be made, which is, again, a deep reflection on the nation, but where is the nation going and what direction is the nation going? Internationalism is always actually reflecting back on what we want as a nation itself. And this is certainly the case with Gramsci. You know, again, he's writing in a time in which Italy is a very, very young nation. It's still in the process of being, he's saying it can go in a different direction. It doesn't have to go in the direction of a nationalist imperialism. It can go in the direction of another kind of internationalism that isn't the sort of imperial cosmopolitanism, but a much more subalternist cosmopolitanism, I guess. But yes.
I wanted just to come on to this point about the this kind of fusion you talk about between anti-fascism and anti-colonialism, particularly after 1945, and these ex-partisans. I just wondered whether you think there might not be a problem with that fusion, and what it kind of disavows is the long connection between liberalism and colonialism. Colonialism doesn't start with fascism.
Yeah, absolutely.
It starts, as you say, in 1890. Fascism don't come to power till 1922. They don't really start kind of changing the colonial arrangements till the late 20s. So the kind of Italy's short colonial history, at least 32 years pre-fascist, and the last 19 are fascist. But if you kind of merge anti-fascism and anti-colonialism, you tend to erase that whole liberal. And of course, you know, the other countries that were colonial at the same time, France,
We're liberal.
the country of liberty, equality and fraternity, Britain, you know, the country of the mother of parliaments, all had liberal or liberal democratic regimes, but they were colonial. And they carried out the kind of colonial violence that Arendt sees as a kind of dress rehearsal for totalitarian states. So what complicates this is I think it seems to me, the possibility that people like Orsini, Pirelli, Pontecorvo, white Italians who fought in resistance, who then carry that forward into the anti-colonial struggle, kind of might merge fascism and colonialism, collapse them together and forget the fact that colonialism starts with liberalism. And I don't know if you've thought about that.
I did actually, because I looked at yes, it is of course a big contradiction, and there is that very big risk. There was a part of the book that it ended up not going into the book, but the Italian Communist Party had a headquarter, had a sede, how do you say, sort of a branch in Mogadishu, and that is an interesting story because after the colonies fell to the British in 1941, after Mogadishu fell, all the colonies in Africa fell to the British, then there were these communist groups that emerged in the colonies and the Italian colonies. And interestingly, they're often composed of settlers, of course, because they were there. And some of these, the Italian Communist Party staked a claim on Somalia, and this has been documented. They had these documents that they produced for the UN, because when the UN was deciding the settlement of Somalia, what should happen to Somalia after the war, one of the ideas that the Italian Communist Party had was that Italy should continue to administer it, so this is coming from the left. It's not at all that the Communist Party was against colonialism, or that that, as you say, of course, that not only liberalism but even more extreme left groups or political formations are actually often in favor of colonialism. Of course, then it becomes an administered territory on the part of Italy. It becomes a trusteeship. But there was a very strong will on the part of the Italian Communist Party to somehow maintain these colonies, or this connection, the colonial connection to Italy. And they say this, and they kind of do this weird disavowal of fascism, saying, well, yeah, of course there were the fascists, but, we built the roads. The usual rhetoric. It kind of like persists even above and beyond.
They have fascism now.
Sorry?
That's why there's fascist groups there now, because they had that reformist approach.
Yeah. So it is an ambivalent history.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying where this goes. This isn't really your project. I mean, I think this whole international sort of the way that the invasion of Ethiopia galvanized the whole kind of black internationalism, the Pan-African movement is incredibly important. I'm sure sure you map that out in a way. I don't think it's been done before in this systematic way. So I'm not saying that this isn't really important. All I'm saying is I think from the point of view of an Italian historian of Italy, one of the problems with the way that colonial past has been remembered or misremembered is that it's been conflated with fascism. Nicola Lebanc has talked about this, so that it's made it easy for post-war Italians to forget they had a colonial past going back to 1890 because it's simply bad fascism. Once we got rid, of course they fall around the same time. The colonies all disappear in 1941, fascism is defeated in 1943 or 45, depending on when you date that. So it's very easy to forget that fact that the colonial project synchronizes with Britain, Germany, France, Belgium. The same kind of violence is being carried out in the colonies, massacres of people. I mean, the first massacres in Libya in 1911, Sharashat, just at the moment of the invasion. So it's not the fascists who invent colonial violence. They get it from the British and the French, and they carry out their own version of it. But if you date the kind of bad bit of colonialism from 1930 or 22 or whenever, you erase that collective history. Italians are brava gente, they built roads, they did nice things. It's only the fascists who turned it sour. And that's a real problem for a kind of memory of that. And I think possibly Pirelli and Pontecorvo unwittingly contributed to that narrative.
Yes, because they never speak about colonialism. They never speak about Italian colonialism. That is completely forgotten. I'm sure that they thought, like Pirelli and Pontecorvo, I'm sure that they identified Italy's colonial past with fascism. And so that they were not concerned with it because Italy was not a colonial power as far as they were concerned. That's definitely the case because their battles are fought alongside the Algerians, for example, both Pontecorvo, so many of the Vietnam, so the anti-fascists of the post-war period of the 60s and 70s certainly have no idea, or they don't have Italy in mind as one of the erstwhile colonial powers that they should be fighting against. What they see is a fascist power, the remnants of a fascist power. No, that's for sure. I mean, that is certainly, that's why, there was a whole section of the book that I then didn't include on Somalia and on that sort of ambivalent, the persistence of a colonial discourse within the Italian Communist Party. And you can see that even in the 30s, actually. It's not the case that, arguably it was strategic on the part of the Italian Communist Party to side with the Ethiopians. I haven't said this. I mean, I'm giving, of course, a certain kind of narrative. But, I was very fascinated by the connections that that there were these very productive alliances between anti-fascists and anti-colonialists. But for sure, the Italian Communist Party doesn't have this, pure relationship to the colony.
Sure. Some more questions?
I have a question about the cover of your book. Can you say something about the building, the history? Why did you choose that?
Oh, I chose it because I have a friend who... this is a photograph taken with a Polaroid camera of the Fiataliero building in Asmara. So this is a building in the capital of Eritrea, Asmara. My friend took a series of photos, I think, in the early 2000s. He visited Eritrea and he took photos of the Italian colonial buildings. Asmara was almost entirely rebuilt in the lead up to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia at the end of between 1929 and 1930 with modernist architecture. And some have argued, Mia Fuller and other historians argue that it was a sort of colonial laboratory for modernist and rationalist architecture. They were able to build architecture in this style even more than in Italy itself, which of course there were limitations to how much they could really build in Italy. But Asmara presented itself as this great, blank slate almost. Literally, so the built environment becomes an expression of Italian civilization and of fascism. So that's why I was. And there's a great line by Evelyn Waugh about Italian colonialism in the 30s. He says Italians were waiting to demonstrate their new virility, that somehow these buildings were embodying a new form of Italian identity that is very masculinist, and of course they're all very tall and vertical and all that. But I also thought the building was beautiful, and the other thing that I liked was that there's a lot about. These photographs have also been criticized for being about imperial nostalgia because they're contemporary photos of the buildings. But I thought that it was resonant for these reasons.
And what about the alphabet? Is that original in the photo? Because the alphabet is like the local alphabet, no? Like the letters, it has like a bunch of letters.
Yeah, I was looking at.
It's since it has like the Ethiopian alphabet.
Yeah, I know, it does look like that, but I
think
don't
that
know.
Italians would use.
I don't really know. I don't know. Does anybody know? I don't really know about this. Sorry?
Did you put the picture back on the screen?
So the typography was very experimental in that period.
Oops, sorry. This again, sorry.
Okay. Sorry, while you're looking, yeah. Are there other questions? Or we probably need to give you a break, Neelam. You worked pretty hard and you had a flight this morning. So thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating. And thank you.
Thank you so much for